The apocalypse. When an entire people are destroyed or destroy themselves. The end of civilization. For us today, as we go about our daily lives, it's barely something we consider. We're so sure it couldn't happen to us. But for some civilizations, it already has. Since the dawn of human history, we have told each other stories about the sea, about its power over life and death. In the Torah, the Quran, and the Bible is the story of the Great Flood. When Noah built an ark as the sea flooded the land, killing everything in its path.
Societies all across the world are replete with examples of stories of lands that have been lost and covered over. People have done something wrong and this is God's punishment.
Or the story of the lost city of Atlantis, told by the great Greek philosopher Plato. A utopian island that people have devoted their lives to finding beneath the waves.
Right across the world, in almost every culture, there is a flood story. A story where water can both cleanse and destroy.
Across our planet are myths and legends of the sea rising up and wiping out civilizations. But what if these stories aren't just stories? Scientists now claim to have found a lost world at the bottom of the sea, called Doggerland. It existed about 10,000 years ago and was a place that was almost perfect for its Stone Age inhabitants.
It's a rich place. It has wetlands where you had wildfowl in abundance, where fish in the rivers were migrating, where you had all the animals and plants that you'd want, and also all the resources, flint and wood and everything else was out there.
Doggerland's temperate climate would have made this a beautiful and abundant region for its hunter-gatherer population.
Plants and animals that we recognise today: hazel, ash, pine, large game, horse, bison, deer, antelope and elk.
Doggerland sounds like paradise. But this world no longer exists. So we must ask the question, what exactly happened to Doggerland? Our search begins in the North Sea. This sea was created at the end of the Ice Age, about 15,000 years ago. As the ice melted and receded, it created the North Sea between Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and the UK. Its power and hidden depths have captured the human imagination. And it has also, for thousands of years, provided humans with a staple food: fish. From the east coast of Great Britain, the British have for generations sailed from the ports of Norfolk, 100 miles northeast of London, to fish the North Sea. And in September 1931, a vessel was trawling near the Lehman and Ower banks. It was captained by Pilgrim E. Lockwood.
About 25 miles out, he lowers his nets and he trawls the ocean for fish. As he lifted them up into the boat, among the sort of shining fish is a massive, what they call peat log. It's a big, like, boulder, not of rock, but of mud. He and his men start breaking it up with shovels. As he puts his shovel in, it goes ding, and he's like, that's really weird. That sounds a bit like metal. So he digs through and he uncovers this sort of black shape. And on it is a load of ridges cut into it. So it's sort of almost like a barb. And it's got little grooves at this end. So presumably this is some sort of, like, you know, harpoon or hook or something.
He prized away and found a lovely bone-handled harpoon point. Intrigued, you don't find these things every day in the North Sea, he brought it home.
Lockwood had found an implement made out of the bone from a deer's antler, about 15 centimeters in length and with a serrated side, so it could be used to harpoon prey.
But how on earth did it get there? Because it's in a load of mud, which has been under the ocean.
What was the harpoon doing in the middle of the North Sea? Who made it and when? Our story now moves to Cambridge University. Here, in 1932, works a young, ambitious archaeologist called Graham Clark. Clark would go on to become one of Europe's greatest archaeologists, seen here winning the Erasmus Prize in 1990.
Graham Clark, who's a very tenacious scholar. He wants to make a name for himself, and he's decided to study a whole new area that hasn't really been looked into before, which is the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age.
Clark was fascinated by the period from about 10,000 to 4,000 years from today. Clark believed the harpoon from Lockwood was similar to those used by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Scandinavia, known as the Magalmose. But this creates a greater mystery. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were known to be able to fish and had fishing boats. But what were they doing harpooning fish so far out to sea? The first step for Clark was to identify that the harpoon was indeed Mesolithic. Today, scientists rely on a process called radiocarbon dating. This involves measuring the decay of the isotope carbon-14 and comparing that to levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But without this complex modern technique, how would Clark date the harpoon? To try and solve this, Clark turned to his friends and botanists, Harry and Margaret Godwin.
The Godwins were a husband and wife couple, and they were from the University of Cambridge at the same time as Graham Clark, and they specialised in palynology, the study of plants and their remains, things like pollen.
Harry and Margaret Godwin were working on a technique that relied not on the decay of carbon isotopes to date objects, but instead used ancient pollen. The Godwins might not be able to date the harpoon itself, but they could date the peat it was found in through pollen analysis.
They specifically went out and trawled up another block of peat very, very close to where they'd found the harpoon and actually analysed it.
What the Godwins found would change the way the seabed of the North Sea is seen forever.
It was showing things that we have today, pine trees, alder, as well as things like oak. You know, this wasn't a block of mushy mess that had come from an estuary. This was a part of a landscape that was living and breathing with all the things that we would expect on dry land today.
These were plants which were nowhere near the sea. So what on earth are they doing underneath the North Sea?
What the Godwins now had to do was work out what time period these types of tree and pollen were from. Working with other scientists in Scandinavia and Germany, they had built up a list of time zones, or chronozones, based on pollen found in prehistoric peat. The results are as Clarke predicted. The pollen in the peat near where the harpoon was found dates to the Mesolithic age. This proves the harpoon is, most likely, from that period. But what Clarke still can't answer is how did the harpoon get to the middle of the North Sea? Could the peat, pollen, and harpoon really have been washed out that far into the North Sea? Clarke created a map showing pollen discoveries across northern Europe. And he wondered if there wasn't a landmass, now hidden under the North Sea, that had once linked all of northern Europe. A land that could have been inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. As it turned out, Clarke wasn't the first to come up with this unusual idea. In the early years of the 20th century, the botanist Clement Reid used to walk the beaches and sand dunes of Norfolk in England. As a botanist, he was fascinated by the plants and trees of today and where they had originally come from.
Clement Reid became obsessed with a thing called Noah's Woods. What it is when the tide goes out in some locations, you can see tree stumps, which is a bit odd. Loads of people at the time called this phenomenon Noah's Woods because they thought they were leftovers, remnants of Noah's flood. But Clement Reid didn't think that was possible. So Clement Reid got the bit between his teeth and decided to investigate.
Reid dug beneath the coastlines and into the depths of the sea to see what he could find. He asked the question, were there forests and animals living in these areas thousands of years ago? From his finds, Reid came up with a theory he published in a book called Submerged Forests. It suggested that somewhere under the North Sea was a landmass that could support forests and animals. Reid suggested there was an alluvial plain connecting all of northern Europe, with its heart at somewhere called Dogger Bank.
Clement Reid writes this amazing book called Submerged Forest, where he theorises a massive landmass linking the UK to the rest of Europe. He had so little evidence for it, though. Nevertheless, this was a book that was really groundbreaking. His main issue was that nobody really cared. Nobody was really obsessed with this subject as much as he was.
Reid's was a pretty unusual idea, without much evidence to support it at the time, and his work was derided by the scientific community. Reid's work was seen as nothing more than science fiction and was all but forgotten until 80 years later. In the 1990s, pioneering British archaeologist Professor Brian E. Coles became intrigued about Reid's work. At the time of Professor Coles's work, oil exploration in the North Sea was developing rapidly, allowing unexpected avenues of research.
There was the geological surveys coming from things like the North Sea oil explorations of that period. I began to draw together the geological and the archaeological evidence that this was a terrain that had its contours, its river systems, that these were things that we're totally unaware of.
Professor Coles used numerous maps, including the ones made by Graham Clark in the 1930s, to estimate how the ice caps melted after the Ice Age and what land masses that might have created.
I realized quite soon that we needed to have maps showing the changes at intervals because things were changing and it might take 1,000 years to change.
Coles' work suggested that in the region where the harpoon was found, there might actually have been dry land. But would anyone accept Professor Coles' idea?
When I was doing the mapping, I realized that it would be much easier not have to say the land that used to be under the North Sea every time, but to give it a name of its own. To get across the idea that it had been not just a drowned landscape, but a living, live, dryland landscape.
Based on the name of the fishing area, Dogger Bank, Coles called this new landmass Doggerland. And that's really important because as soon as somewhere has a name, it becomes a place, not just in reality, but also in the imagination.
And Coles went on. She posited the theory that not only was Reid correct about the existence of a lost landmass in the North Sea, but it meant something even more unexpected.
It was a huge area with rivers, with bays and inlets, with areas of high ground, hills, if you will, and low-lying areas that are now entirely submerged, but then would have been absolutely at the heart of the post-glacial landscape of Northern Europe.
So if this was a landscape, was there evidence to suggest that it had one day supported human life? Across the North Sea, in present-day Holland, a few hundred miles from Norfolk, is the beach of Zandmotor. There, beachcombers hunt for hidden treasure. Coins, bones, a message in a bottle, anything unusual gifted by the sea.
Dat hier zo ook afgebroken is, eventueel.
The beachcombers coordinate their finds with Dr. Luc Amkrutz, a specialist archaeologist from the nearby University of Leiden. They work with Dr. Amkrutz because Zandmotor Beach isn't like any other beach.
I'm sitting here on Zandmotor Beach, but it's not an ordinary beach. It's a beach created by man in 2011 by spraying a whole lot of sand from the North Sea on this beach plain.
It was constructed out of materials dredged up from the sea floor 11 kilometers offshore and dumped on the existing beach. Material dredged from an area of the sea close to where Lockwood found the harpoon.
What was so special when they created this beach is that all kinds of objects came to the surface. Wow.
Yeah.
They were the bones of animals living in, for instance, the Ice Ages, like woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros. Most astonishing of all is that it wasn't just the animal remains, but amongst these there were also hundreds of artifacts made by humans and even by Neanderthals, which is of course really strange given that they come from the North Sea.
Over the years, beachcombers have found more than 500 ancient artifacts, including tools, bone fishhooks, and even human remains that they say are thousands of years old.
Zandmotor and certain other areas really brought home the enormity of this huge archaeological archive in front of our coast. We have this whole range of organic artifacts that is preserved, and it's actually basically as if you're looking at a complete carpenter's tool set. And it really brought home the idea of this is a whole world, a whole people landscape that was there, which is now lost. The more touching finds from Doggerland are not just the artifacts, but the human remains themselves. And one story I find particularly moving is this lower mandible. This person was about 14 years when he or she died. You're not just looking at the objects, or you're not just looking at the food remains, but you're looking at the actual people themselves.
And Luke's group are not the only ones finding things on the beach. Since the 1970s, hundreds of amateur archaeologists have made findings on the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and the UK. Under the North Sea, there are signs of an entire living world, of not just animals, but also people. But the question remains, who were they, and what happened to them? In 2005, a European team of scientists centred at the University of Bradford in the UK wanted to see exactly what Doggerland might have looked like. But they knew it wasn't going to be easy.
The area obviously was very inaccessible. It's obviously underwater, between, 5 and 30 metres in some places, down to 60, 80 in others. Obviously that water is very cold, so you can't go diving easily in it. It's very powerful currents in some places. The other thing, of course, was the technologies and the techniques that we use hadn't been developed in some cases, or were in their early infancy.
There was no way that archaeologists could excavate under the seabed in these dangerous waters. It was beyond their technical abilities and would have cost hundreds of millions of euros. It looked like Doggerland would remain forever a subject of speculation and mystery, unproven by scientific fact. But at a yearly symposium, one of the PhD students at the time, Simon Fitch, had an unusual idea.
As I was sitting there in the lecture hall, I realised that actually I'd worked on material, seismic data which came from that area, and that data possibly could be retasked. It could actually be used to look under the water to see the landscape.
In the early 2000s, the North Sea was going through a renewed oil and gas boom. Billions of euros worth of oil and gas were being discovered using new technology. If the Bradford team could access the data from that technology, then maybe they could see under the seabed, and whether there was evidence that Doggerland did once exist. The Bradford team approached oil and gas exploration companies to access their specialist mapping data.
Surveyors for oil and gas exploration were going up and down, surveying the North Sea with a fine-toothed comb to pull together a series of contour maps of the sea floor. This was a huge swathe of land, tens of thousands of square kilometres.
What the Bradford team wanted in particular was the data for 3D seismic maps. These are created by specialist ships, dragging thousands of listening devices, called hydrophones, along the surface of the sea. They listen to sound waves bouncing off whatever lies beneath the seabed. The resulting data shows where, hidden under the seabed, there may be deposits of oil or gas to drill for.
Seismic mapping is a really good way to do a quick analysis of a large amount of submerged landscape, mapping the seabed in the same way as we see inside a stomach when we're doing sonograms, for instance. And you use the sonar pulses and you get a little echo back, and you get the shape appearing on the screen.
But would this help the Bradford team? Could the data help build a picture of a land now hidden under the seabed? Having waited some months, the team finally got the data for the Doggerland area. They inputted it into a computer. They waited for the first seismic maps.
So we plugged that in and then put it into the computer, and up popped this remarkable image. We could actually see a river which was alive and vibrant when the Mesolithic people were wandering around on top of Dogger Bank. It was a phenomenal, almost like lunar landing type of moment. You know, you felt you were seeing something which no one had ever seen before. I think that was when all the jewels dropped and we realised the implications of what we were looking at, and was providing a doorway into a lost world. It was just a phenomenal realisation that all those questions that people had had before us could be answered.
It was just as Bryony Coles and Clement Reid had suggested. A hidden world of rivers, lagoons, and wetlands.
We could map features in the landscape. We've seen rivers, we've seen lakes, we've seen little hills. We've seen everything in a landscape you'd expect in a normal country, except this is under the sea, and it's preserved, and it's caches of material and archaeology sitting out there waiting for us to go and find it.
The Bradford team had seen Doggerland for the first time. But the mapping still didn't answer the biggest question. What happened to the peoples who lived there? To understand that, scientists had to investigate how the people might have lived. Human evolution is heavily influenced by geography and climate. So the first thing to establish is roughly what kind of climate Doggerland would have had. This is done by looking at the position of Doggerland geographically at the time.
We know that immediately after the end of the last ice age, it was frozen. It was like the Siberian tundra, but then very rapidly started to warm, to thaw out. And that enabled new species to start to colonize this land. Doggerland would have grown into a landscape that we would recognize now. The winters were shorter and less harsh, and the summers were longer and warmer. And plants start to colonize this land. Trees start to grow. A lot of the species that we're familiar with now, so hazel, ash, oak, willow. Animals start to colonize because they're following the food. So you get herds of horse and bison and elk.
But the question remained, could Doggerland support human populations? And if so, what would those people have been like? A clue comes from Yorkshire in northern England. In 1948, Graham Clark, the archaeologist who had dated the harpoon from the North Sea, was told of a discovery of flint and bone at a place called Star Carr.
10,000 years ago, it was on the edge of a massive paleo lake. Because of the nature of this landscape and the waterlogging in the modern farmland, it means that there's been an incredible level of preservation at Star Carr.
For the next 3 years, Clark led the dig at Star Carr, and his team uncovered one of the best Mesolithic settlements in Europe.
So we have organic remains, animal bones. There are harpoon points beautifully crafted from deer antlers.
By looking at Star Carr today, we can build a picture of what lives the people of Doggerland might have led. The site has been further excavated by Professor Nikki Milner.
think it's very easy to sometimes look at the past and think back 11,000 years and that people must have lived very basic lives. But the evidence that we've got from Star-Kar is that they were very good at making things, at crafting things.
Star-Kar shows many tools made from animals and made to kill animals, similar to the harpoon Lockwood found in 1931.
We have all sorts of animal remains and plant remains from the site, which shows us the types of animals they're hunting and their expertise in gathering and living off the land.
They're hunter-gatherers, and these are bushcraft experts. They're armed with a whole range of skills and expertise that means that they can thrive in this landscape.
At Star-Kar is also what's known as the oldest house in Britain, dating from about 9,000 years ago.
So we found a number of houses, which are the earliest known houses in this country. So that told us that people were able to build structures out of wood. We understand more about their woodworking skills and how sophisticated those must have been, and that they could make structures, and that involves teamwork.
Mesolithic people, it appears, were hunter-gatherers. They were highly mobile, but they were also living together and growing together as a community.
If we're now thinking about people who have places that they regularly spend long periods of time at, that they invest their resources in to build houses, no longer could we write these people off as simple, knuckle-dragging cave dwellers, clad in simple animal skins, eking away a living at the edges of the Ice Age. These were people who shaped their landscape.
One of the most unusual finds at Star-Kar was shaped from the skulls of killed deer.
One of the most iconic and remarkable discoveries from Star-Kar are the antler headdresses. And they've been shaped by human hands over hours and hours and hours of labour.
The headdresses are really mysterious. There are none others known in this country and only a few in the rest of Europe. They're made of red deer skulls with the antler coming out of them. There are two main theories. One is that they might have been used as disguises in hunting practices, and the other is that they might have been used by shamans in some kind of ritual practices.
The headdresses offer clear, incontrovertible evidence that these people had a sophisticated culture to create these artifacts that have no functional purpose, but clearly have a very important spiritual purpose.
Star-Kar helps build a picture of how sophisticated people might have lived on Doggerland. But who were these people? What did they look like? To see what a Mesolithic person might have looked like, we must travel to the south of England and the Cheddar Gorge. It was here that one of Europe's oldest Mesolithic men, Cheddar Man, was found.
Cheddar Man is one of the really important discoveries in this country. Cheddar Man was found over 100 years ago in Somerset and has been studied a lot ever since because human remains are incredibly rare, particularly in this country for the Mesolithic.
Cheddar Man is the oldest British, most complete human skeleton that we have. It dates to around 10,000 years old.
And in 2018, a groundbreaking analysis was made of Cheddar Man's DNA in an attempt for us to meet our ancestors face to face.
It gives us an insight into what people look like, and what we know from Cheddar Man is he was about 5'5". From the DNA, we know he had dark, curly hair, blue eyes, and darker skin than we imagined, certainly darker than European skin tends to be today. So although he looks quite striking to us, he would have looked quite normal then.
Now we could finally see the faces of the sort of people that would have lived at Star-Kar and Doggerland. Despite living thousands of years ago, it helps us understand who lived here But it still doesn't answer the big question. How did people who made Doggerland their home come to disappear? To understand better what might have happened, the Bradford team decided to actually dig into Doggerland. They did this by taking core samples.
If you take a giant pipe, you ram it into the seabed, and then you pull it out, the column of mud that you pull out, that's a core. So when you look at a core, what you're effectively looking at are slices of time. It's like a diary of the deep past. They are hugely important for our understanding of how our climate has changed and environmental conditions have changed. And they're also crucial to our understanding of the archaeology of Doggerland and what happened to the people.
What the Bradford team saw is how, with the end of the Ice Age, the sea level was rising at over a metre every 100 years.
Those sediments preserve in them a record of how sea level changes. So at one particular site, it will show the history of going from dry land through to the area becoming waterlogged and eventually being submerged.
But the team noticed that in one particular time period, the sea levels seemed to rise significantly.
If you look at the cores taken from Doggerland, when you get to 8,000 years ago, there's a huge change.
But what caused this huge change, and what effect did it have on Doggerland? Around 8,000 years ago, there is what is called the 8.2 kilo year event, meaning 8.2 thousand years from today, or roughly 6,250 BCE. Scientists noticed that the planet's sea levels rose dramatically. One explanation for this change is with the warming of the planet after the Ice Age came the collapse of a colossal ice sheet into the Atlantic Ocean. The Laurentide ice sheet in what is present-day North America.
At its peak, the Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and a fair proportion of the top of the United States. Ice was over what is now New York and Chicago and St. Louis. This was millions and millions and millions of tons of water locked up in ice. This was the biggest release of freshwater into the North Atlantic for 100,000 years. So profound was this change that it dropped the sea temperatures by a degree, almost overnight. And that changed the Gulf Stream, which changed the air temperatures by up to 1.5 degrees centigrade in a generation.
As the meltwater filled the oceans, global sea levels rose by as much as half a metre in a few months, threatening lowlands like Doggerland.
All the reasons that made Doggerland a fantastic place to live as a hunter-gatherer also made it particularly vulnerable to sea level change. It was low-lying, it was cut through with rivers and streams and marshy areas, which was fantastic for fishing and fowling and gathering those wild resources, but it also meant that if the sea levels rose, it would be inundated, and inundated very rapidly.
The sea level rise was so pronounced that it turned Doggerland into islands. Doggerland would now have been cut off from continental Europe and the UK. So what did this mean for the people on Doggerland?
After the 8.2 event, the sea levels rose so significantly that it was easily within generations, easily within people's lifetimes. They could easily see the effects of sea level rise. These people had an intimate knowledge of the landscape around them. And for that to start changing must have been extraordinarily disorientating and confusing.
What would have been fertile river valleys suddenly became flood valleys. Huge swathes of low-lying land would have been lost almost immediately, and that destroys the animals you're relying on, that destroys the plants you're relying on.
And so when all this changes, this puts huge pressure on the people living there, and it would have been scary for them.
The hunter-gatherer paradise of Doggerland was slowly sinking beneath the waves. So what could Mesolithic people do?
If you're a Mesolithic person and your land gets flooded, where do you go? Well, you obviously, follow the animals, follow the herds. That's, where your food source goes. So you're going to do that because some of them would have gone to Britain and what is now mainland Europe.
Some of the people would have relocated into other parts of today's Europe, like Germany and the Netherlands, and others to Great Britain.
From the archaeological evidence, we have a number of Mesolithic boats. It's exactly at this point, as the sea levels are rising, that we start to get this really good evidence for the use of dugout canoes in Britain and in northwest Europe. Hunter-gatherers are fantastic at being flexible, and maybe even people started adapting to being much more sea-dwelling.
But the question remained. What happened to the people who stayed on Doggerland? As the Bradford team looked further into the core samples, they found something that would have been terrifying. They found what might be the key to the apocalypse of Doggerland. In a time period around 6000 BCE, the core samples looked more mixed up than expected.
There was a series of sand, shell, jumbled up with sequences within it which looked so unusual, so different to everything else we'd seen in our careers, except for the few samples we've seen published in literature, which were tsunami samples.
This mixing up of sediment suggested huge force, a great wave of power, a tsunami. But what could have caused such a wave? The team connects the unusual core samples to an event called the Storegga Slide, when vast areas of the Norwegian continental shelf slid into the sea.
The Storegga Slide was a huge submarine landslide that occurred off the coast of Norway. The slide itself is made up of sediments deposited from the glacial era, so it's a lot of fine muds and sands. And within it, there are lots of weak layers. These are layers that can't really hold all that sediment together. So they're very prone to slipping. So any trigger, like an earthquake, is enough to set this sediment in motion and move down slope. And as it does so, it will generate a wave because it will disturb the surface of the water.
A tsunami would have been terrifying, and is something that our modern society has witnessed. In both 2011 in Japan and across Asia in 2004. You can see here how the 2004 tsunami spread across almost the entire globe. So what effect would the Storegga Slide tsunami have had on Doggerland? Dr. John Hill of the University of York recreated how the tsunami might have hit Northern Europe in a series of computer simulations.
The Storegga Slide involved 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, and it probably moved in one go very quickly. So this huge slide, which is probably one of the biggest landslides in the history of the Earth, generated a huge tsunami, which then traveled across the North Atlantic to Greenland and then down the North Sea with a tsunami of 10 to 6 meters impacting the coast of the UK.
In this scientifically accurate simulation, the remaining islands of Doggerland are repeatedly washed over by the elevated red waves. The core samples also suggested that the timing of the wave was critical for people on Doggerland.
So one of the things I find surprising is our ability to pinpoint the time of year that Storegga occurred. So we do this by looking at the sediments that have been deposited, and in them we find bits of vegetation like mosses and cherry stones, where we know that they would have occurred in the autumn, and hence we can find out that the Storegga Slide actually happened in the autumn.
It is believed that Mesolithic people in the summer went inland to hunt deer, but in the autumn, with fewer deer to eat, they returned to the shoreline. the tsunami from the Storegga slide would have hit the Mesolithic people when they were at their most vulnerable.
Doggerland would have been particularly affected by this because it is so low-lying. Even though it was about 130 kilometres across and perhaps 80 kilometres north to south, the average height was probably on the order of metres rather than tens of metres. So if you have a wave that is 5 metres high, it is obviously going to inundate a large proportion of that land. And if we look to modern events like the Japanese 2011 tsunami, the average height there is around 5 metres. The wave inundated up to 4 kilometres inland. So if you think of that kind of scale, you would have seen something similar happening at Doggerland.
The coastline is exactly where we would have seen the majority of people. The tsunami would have laid waste to homes, fish traps going, hunting grounds disappearing. Whole societies were perhaps wiped out in the space of a few hours.
For Doggerland, it could have been cataclysmic, covering most of the land in its fast-moving water. Many of those Doggerland people could have been washed away, along with their homes.
From the archaeological record, we do get a sense that actually the tsunami is the beginning of the end, if not the end of Doggerland. And large swathes of it are already underwater, and what remains would have been quite significantly devastated for some time.
Death as a great wave swept through Doggerland. Doggerland still occasionally gives up its human evidence from beneath the seabed. In 2019, a hammerstone was dredged up from the drowned land. But the Bradford team concluded that with rising sea levels, Doggerland, the land that connected all of Northern Europe, would have sunk under the sea, ending all human life.
The Storegga tsunami was a difficult period for the Mesolithic people, but the land did recover. However, after that period, sea level continued to rise. The landscape continued to shrink and break up into different islands, so the challenges increased for people. And so really it's part of the beginning of the end. Eventually people would have found it perhaps too difficult to live in certain places and moved.
As of today, scientists are yet to find any artifact from the Doggerland area that dates after the tsunami.
We don't find any human artifacts after this wave. So there's absolutely nothing that dates from younger than 6,100 BC, which just shows the devastation this wave probably caused.
The tsunami's devastation seems total. Doggerland. A Mesolithic paradise that supported human populations, animals, forests, and wetlands. A land that at one point is estimated to have stretched from what today is Northern Europe to Scandinavia and the UK, covering almost 50,000 square kilometers. Hunter-gatherers of the time could have walked from present-day Berlin to Oslo, to London, to Paris. A region that in the space of possibly only a few hundred years was completely swallowed by the sea, drowning everything that lived on it. An ancient apocalypse which echoes through human history, through the myths and legends of great floods, and still touches us today. The Bible. It's one of the most influential texts ever written. For millennia, it's shaped the lives of billions of people. It holds stories of great civilizations, miraculous events, the Word of God, Many people see them as parables for how to live their lives. But for some, these stories are historical truth. Of all the events the Bible details, one remains shocking, even today: the destruction of Sodom. According to the Bible, Sodom was one of the 5 cities of the plain. It was remarkable for its wickedness.
The tradition is that the sin of Sodom was what the Bible describes to be sexual perversity, specifically homosexuality.
But is this really true? In the Bible story, God appeared before Abraham and told him his plan to destroy Sodom and the cities of the plain. For Abraham, it's a shocking revelation. His nephew Lot lived in Sodom.
According to the Bible, Lot and his family were different than the other people living in Sodom. They would be considered righteous people.
Abraham pleaded with God not to destroy the innocent and guilty without distinction. God assured Abraham that he would spare the city if just 10 decent people could be found there, and devised a test of Sodom's hospitality to strangers.
The Bible says specifically that the sin of Sodom was arrogance, gluttony, and apathy, and specifically that they were not kind to the poor and the needy, that it was inhospitality, this general unkindness towards other people that made Sodom an evil city.
God sends 2 angels disguised as travelers to meet with Lot, who takes them in and treats them well. Lot passes God's hospitality test. But when the news of the foreigners' arrival spreads through Sodom, the city descends on Lot's house and demands he hands them over.
Immediately, all the neighbors are banging on the door saying, "Send out these 2 men so that we may know them." And in biblical terms, that usually means to sleep with them. Lot says, "Absolutely not. You can have my daughters instead. They're virgins. You can do whatever you want with them, but you cannot have my guests." At that point, God steps in and says, "No, the test has failed."
It's damning. The angels allow Lot and his family to leave, but when they are gone, God levels the city with the remaining inhabitants inside.
It would have been positively terrifying.
God destroyed them in a shower of fire and brimstone, so terrible that no man could live in this land.
The destruction was so complete that the city was abandoned for 700 years. It's a profound punishment for the city's perceived sins.
God sends these 2 angels down to Sodom and the cities of the plain to test their hospitality, to see would they be welcomed, and they failed that test. So it's less a story about sexuality, and it's more a story about hospitality. Hospitality was so important in the ancient world.
Only after the rise of Christianity, in the first few centuries CE, did its interpretation change. Early Christian theologians shifted the story's focus away from offering hospitality to create a morality tale condemning homosexuality. But does the story of destruction hold any truth? We ask the question, did the city of Sodom actually exist? And could it be possible to locate its ruins? According to the ancient writings of the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah, Sodom was supposedly part of what's known as the 5 cities of the plain. They were situated in southern Canaan, a large region covering modern-day Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Of the 5 cities, Sodom was the largest, and thus the epicenter of the plain. For centuries, archaeologists have tried to locate it.
I think everybody loves a good lost city story, whether it's Atlantis or Sodom. There's this treasure hunter aspect to it. There's a confirming mythology, a way of confirming the historicity of oral tradition.
But if the story of Sodom is more than just a myth, like some believe? Where did it take place? And how could archaeologists locate it? Renowned biblical archaeologists Dr. Thomas Schaab and Walter Rast carry out surveys of Bab Edra. It is an ancient site southeast of the Dead Sea.
Thomas Schaab and Walter Rast were actually very well-respected archaeologists and academics in the field, and both had a keen interest in biblical archaeology and historical geography. Schaab was actually a priest, and Walter Rast actually led many expeditions to the Dead Sea.
As the two break ground, they discover 4 more sites nearby: Numera, Safi, Pfeiffer, and Kanazir. For Schaab and Rast, the number of sites could be a crucial indicator for whether Bab Edra is Sodom.
The Bible says that Sodom was one of 5 cities of the plain. And if 4 other cities were discovered near Bab Edra, it increases the likelihood that Bab Edra is the city of Sodom.
The discovery of these 5 ancient sites in close proximity to each other is key. And through excavations at Bab Edra, the archaeologists date the site to around 3,300 BCE.
This is significant because some people think this is when the city of Sodom existed too.
And during excavations, the team unearthed evidence that not only was Bab Edra the largest of the 5 sites, but it was also once the location of a thriving community.
There were fortification walls around the town. Archaeologists were able to identify people's houses, workshops. It would have been a place of some significance.
For Schaab and Rast, it's looking more and more likely that Bab Edra is Sodom. And when the archaeologists examine the site more closely, they make a crucial discovery. There is evidence of widespread destruction.
The archaeologists discovered piles of collapsed mud bricks and also large piles of ash and charcoal, and the town walls had been destroyed by fire.
At the second site, Numera, Schaab and Rast make similar findings. But most astonishingly, archaeologists find the skeletons of several people.
The bodies were buried under all of this burnt debris. So these were people who had died and been crushed while they were still either fresh corpses or while they were still alive.
Some experts believe that Schaab and Rast's findings match the biblical description of the destruction of Sodom through fire and brimstone.
There's one camp who think that Bab Edra and Numera are evidence of destruction from an earthquake and catastrophic fires, that we found our target.
The claim that the southern site of Bab Edra could be the former city of Sodom becomes known as the Southern Theory. But had biblical Sodom finally been uncovered? Over the years, new evidence has emerged which casts doubt on the theory.
When excavations were carried out at the other 3 sites, archaeologists found that there were no occupational structures. What they had found was a bunch of cemeteries. This is a place where people buried their dead.
And radiocarbon dating of the 2 largest sites, Bab Edra and Numera, cast further doubt on the Southern Theory.
These 2 cities were destroyed 2.5 centuries apart from one another. That's 250 years in between the destruction of Bab Edra and Numera.
To match the biblical description, these sites should all have been destroyed at the same time.
They don't fit the time. So, yeah, to me, it's 2 strikes and you're out. You don't need a 3rd strike.
The Southern Theory just does not hold water.
Did Sodom ever exist? If so, was it at all possible to find? In 1996, archaeologist Dr. Stephen Collins takes up the challenge. Having grown up in a Christian household, he has long been fascinated with the relationship between the Bible and scientific evidence.
I had sort of worlds in collision going on in my head, and it was hard to justify science and faith and belief together.
Joining Dr. Collins in the search for Sodom is Dr. Philip Sylvia, an electrical engineer by trade. In more recent years, he's turned his focus to the Bible and archaeology.
I think Sodom is the epitome in Scripture of God's judgment against sin in the world. And it's the engineer in me. And the theologian in me understands there must be a discoverable trail of physical evidence showing us what he did and how he did it. And that's what drives me.
The more Dr. Collins studied, the more convinced he became that the Bible could provide clues to the location of Sodom.
And so when I look at the historical record, when I look at the biblical record, and it squares with reality, it squares with science, it squares with archaeology, and I can't find any way to overturn it, then what am I supposed to do?
For Dr. Collins, the realization that Sodom and the cities of the plain may not be south of the Dead Sea came about by accident in 1996. That summer, he is leading a tour of the Holy Land sites. While planning an expedition to Bab Edra and Numaira, he rereads the story of Sodom. Something is amiss. In the Bible, before Lot moves to Sodom, he and his uncle Abraham bid farewell to each other. At this time, the Bible places them somewhere between the settlements of Bethel and Ai, northwest of the Dead Sea. From there, they can see the whole plain of Jordan.
The Bible says Lot looked over, saw the well-watered plain of the Jordan, and went eastward and pitched his tent as far as Sodom.
According to the southern theory, Sodom is southeast of the Dead Sea, 80 kilometers from Bethel and Ai. But if Abraham and Lot were in the north at Bethel and Ai, they wouldn't have been able to see that far.
I got to the end of it, and I thought to myself, I don't see anything in there that would locate Sodom toward the south, but everything would locate it north and east of the Dead Sea. How in the world could serious scholars be putting Sodom toward the south into the Dead Sea? Because if they're reading the same text I'm reading, why aren't we seeing the same things?
Collins digs deeper into the ancient text. His focus turns to identifying the correct location for the plain of Jordan.
Genesis 13:10 says that Lot saw the plain of Jordan and that it was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. So if you can find the plain of Jordan, you can find Sodom.
After meticulous studying, Collins finds a clue to the whereabouts of the plain of Jordan. In the Hebrew language, the word for plain is kikar, which means round.
In a case of land, it would be a round, flat area of arable land. That is where we should be looking for Sodom and the cities of the plain.
Some archaeologists believe that the only area in Jordan that has a flat circular plain that is well watered is north of the Dead Sea.
If you are looking at a very good topographical map, you'll see a circular area, a kikar, north of the Dead Sea.
But for some, using the Bible as a geographical source should be approached with caution.
We need to be cautious with how we use the Bible texts. We have to keep in mind that if this event happened, it was another 1,000 years before it was written down. And then since being written down, it's passed through 5, 6, 7 different languages before it comes to us. So to put too much weight on one word is a bit hazardous. If we treat Sodom and the cities of the plain as a crime scene, then the Bible is one source. We also have archaeological evidence. We have ancient maps. So we have to actually look at the whole thing like a puzzle, and each piece has to be put together to really grasp what happened there.
Proponents of this new northern theory are convinced somewhere in this circular plain could lie the biblical city of Sodom. Further evidence may lie in the oldest surviving map of biblical sites, the Mardaba map. It dates from the 6th century CE and is located in the Byzantine Church of St. George in Mardaba, Jordan.
Now, we have to understand that the Byzantine period was the biggest Holy Land tourist industry ever in history. And so this map was on the floor of this church for the singular purpose of showing people where to go.
The map is incomplete, but crucially, it features a key name, Zoar. Along with Sodom, the Bible lists it as one of the 5 cities of the plain.
Zoar is significant because it was the only city of the plain that wasn't destroyed. And it wasn't destroyed, according to the Bible, because it was the city to where Lot and his family escaped.
The map doesn't feature Sodom, but it does feature something else north of the Dead Sea. Partially intact depictions of 2 cities. For Dr. Collins, they're key geographical markers.
I have a sneaking suspicion that those 2 representations of cities on the north end of the Dead Sea are Sodom and Gomorrah.
But if the missing piece of the map is Sodom, where exactly is it? In 2005, Collins and his colleagues head to Jordan in search of hard evidence.
And that was a little bit scary at first because I couldn't find any map of archaeological sites done by anyone in America or Europe or Israel, and it really bothered me. I said, what am I going to find when I get over there?
But then, at the American Center of Oriental Research, a breakthrough. As the team pore over maps and surveys, they come across a book, The Antiquities of the Jordan Rift Valley. In it is a map showing ancient sites in the Kikar region of Jordan, northeast of the Dead Sea. The team put boots on the ground and begin a process of elimination, hoping to identify the most likely site for Sodom.
And what did we find? 14 major archaeological sites. Well, here was the problem. I was only looking for 4 or 5 sites. Now I had 14. Some seemed to be too small, too insignificant, or the wrong period, and so we eliminated them.
After a week of surveying, only one candidate remained, Tal el-Hammam. It's situated 13 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea.
The Bible had told me that Sodom should be the biggest Bronze Age city on the northeast side of the Dead Sea. And guess what? It was just absolutely huge. How in the world had people not put this on their radar? Why was it not on any map?
After almost a decade of research, Tal el-Hammam is Collins' prime suspect for Sodom.
I was walking down on the top of Tal el-Hammam, and I grabbed a handful of that sand and sort of let it run down through my fingers. And I said, someday you're gonna tell me what you know.
But to reveal the truth behind this ancient site, he needs to start digging. On the 27th of December 2005, the team begin the excavation. Initial findings reveal a colossal site, spanning an area of approximately 150 acres. It's much larger than any other Bronze Age site in the region.
I was surprised, I think, mostly the sheer size of the site. To me, it was just a oh wow moment.
With the site larger than anyone had anticipated, Collins recruits world-renowned archaeological architect Dr. Lean Rittmeyer to map the site.
I got a phone call from Dr. Steve Collins. He said, would you like to come to Jordan and see my new excavations? I believe I found Sodom. He said, Sodom? You must be daft. It is quite impossible. He said, just come and have a look. I said, okay, I'll come and have a look. The site and the architecture impressed me very much. And so I was really interested in the site from an archaeological point of view.
During the first few seasons of excavations, the team unearthed fortified walls 5 meters thick and up to 12 meters high. They also find a palace, a temple, and at least 2 plazas, and dozens of houses and streets, all dating to the Middle Bronze Age period when Sodom is believed to have existed.
The Middle Bronze Age fortifications were stunning to me. We estimated the rampart system itself took somewhere between 40 and 60 million mud bricks to make. It was obviously a highly centralized government who could put such a project together and complete it.
I've worked on many archaeological excavations. I've never seen such a huge site. Tel el-Hammam is about 6 times as big as the old city of Jerusalem.
Crucially, the team discover layers of ash throughout, ranging from ½ meter to 2 meters thick. Evidence that Tal el-Hammam was destroyed. And they're convinced it was destroyed in the Middle Bronze Age.
Mixed in with that ash are pieces of pottery that we can identify with that Middle Bronze Age date.
The evidence indicates the site was burnt in 1700 BCE. And as Dr. Sylvia sifts through the ash layer, a picture of a great destructive event emerges. Among the ruins, they find a large 180-kilogram saddle quern that workers used to grind grain.
That's called a saddle quern because you basically would straddle it like you were riding a horse, and then you would run your grinder back and forth like this to grind the grain.
But for Dr. Sylvia, the position of the saddle quern doesn't make any sense.
It was literally blown off of its dirt pedestal onto its side on the ground in a northeasterly direction.
The team are intrigued by how such a large, heavy object could have been blown over. And it's not the only object. Across the site, they uncover artifacts and structures that landed in the same direction, seemingly pushed by some catastrophic force.
You find bits and pieces of pottery, everything you can imagine, strewn for 6, 7, 8 meters across the floor to the northeast. So everything has this directionality to it. Everything inside there is churned up and full of ash and pottery and broken mud bricks, and everything about it is catastrophic.
The team has uncovered evidence of a great destructive event hitting Tal el-Hammam. Dr. Collins calls it the Middle Bronze Destruction Event. What could have caused it? In 2011, the team make a chilling find.
We started finding human bones, piece of a pelvis, piece of a knee bone, piece of a femur. One of them was only existing from the mid-femur down. Everything else is missing. And the place where the separation occurred is severely burned. It's almost like they were burned off.
They appear to have been bodily slammed up against one of the very thick walls and then fell to the ground and were covered in ash and in material there.
These were not lovingly placed burials. These were people who wound up in these positions by some sort of violent event.
In another section, they find further evidence that the inhabitants were killed by an intense force.
In the Middle Bronze Palace area, 2 skulls emerged. We have no lower jaw bones on either one. One, we have the entire skull, and it is smashed down. One has a piece of pelvis right here next to the fragments of the skull. They are literally blown to bits.
For Collins, the location of the skulls is key.
We are 8 meters down and 1 meter deep in the destruction matrix. There is no doubt, zero doubt, that these two individuals, these two skull fragments, belong to the Middle Bronze destruction event itself.
The body is just not designed to stand up to that kind of force. And it's both shocking, it's both traumatizing, but on the other hand, as an engineer, as a scientist, it's absolutely fascinating.
The team believes they are getting closer to discovering what destroyed this city. But so far, nothing conclusive, which tells them this might be biblical Sodom. But the more they excavate, the clearer it becomes that they're dealing with a monumental site. Along the outside of the city, they uncover the foundations of a much larger structure, a 3-meter thick wall.
We asked them to dig a bit further to the east, and there they found the beginning of another wall coming out. Same type of bricks. And as the other one was 3 meters wide, I kind of paced it out. But then it clicked to me, we got here a massive tower extending out from the city wall.
Dr. Rittmeyer and the team have just come across the ruins of a colossal gateway complex, 21 meters wide and 14 meters high, with towers on either side and up to 6 chambers. The Tal El Hammam team are gradually unearthing the secrets of a vast metropolis spanning an area approximately 150 acres, with an estimated population of up to 65,000 inhabitants.
It had all the features of a major city center. I mean, with its palaces, its temples, its residential areas, its streets, its massive fortifications, its satellite towns, its massive agricultural areas that it could take advantage of. It had everything to make it great. And this is what the Bible describes, and this is what the archaeology confirms.
It fits the geographical clues in terms of location. It fits the time frame in terms of its occupation history. To me, I don't see what other conclusion you can come to.
But if they want to convince the wider community that Tal El Hammam is biblical Sodom, then their work is far from over.
I have to say, the site is really interesting. It's the interpretation of the site that I find problematic. So much more work needs to be done before we can understand the site in context and its importance, but also what destroyed it.
Whether or not Tal El Hammam is Sodom remains to be seen. But what's clear from the team's findings is there once existed a large and thriving civilization in this area.
In Tal El Hammam, we got a very definite layout of the city. There you got a lower city and upper city. The lower city were the common people, near the upper city, which had its own separate defense system. It was a totally secluded area used by the king to have his palace and his royal officials.
Artifacts found throughout Tal El Hammam have helped the team decipher how people lived during this time.
Most of the houses are mud brick houses. And the houses themselves were often multi-generational houses. So you got quite a few rooms built around a central courtyard. Then you've had an awning overhead, and that's where they baked the bread, where they roasted their chickens or whatever they were eating, and the women used to grind their flour. All that took place in that courtyard. That was kind of the life of the house.
I mean, we have a city that lasts for 3,000 years without a hiccup. Things are pretty much operating like a well-oiled machine.
But then, according to the evidence, somewhere around 1,700 BCE, during the Middle Bronze Age, the city of Tal El Hammam was violently destroyed. What was behind its catastrophic demise? Could the answer provide a clue as to whether this is the original city of sin? At the site, archaeologists have found evidence of scorched walls and floors buried beneath piles of ash, burned pottery sherds, as well as charred human remains they believe were blown around by some concussive force. For them, the evidence matches the biblical account of fire and brimstone destroying Sodom. But what could cause this?
If you're looking at evidence from Tal el-Hammam, it's reasonable to wonder whether this is a consequence of a huge volcanic event.
Was Tal el-Hammam destroyed by a volcano? In recent decades, experts have found evidence of a volcanic flow of ancient lava in the hills northeast of the Dead Sea, whilst 1/6 of Jordan is covered in hardened lava, known as basalt.
There's lots and lots of basalt rock around that part of the Dead Sea. That's because that area is very geologically active. It's had volcanism throughout much of its history.
But there's a problem with the theory. There's no volcano close to the site of Tal el-Hammam.
To get volcanic activity, you don't need to have a kind of triangular volcanic mountain spewing out of lots of lava or even a dormant volcano. What you need is you need a heat source underneath the surface with molten rock, and you need pathways to the surface by which that heat can get out. And that's what we call a volcanic system. So you can have volcanic systems that are not invisible, but they're pretty hard to detect.
Despite evidence of ancient lava flow in this region, many reject the idea that this is responsible for the destruction of the site.
There's just not enough of the material. You know, you need a really significant amount of ash to really cause the abandonment of a city. And from what we can see, there just doesn't seem to be enough.
But there is another natural event that could be to blame.
Now, if somebody told me, OK, I've got the city ruins and they've been collapsed, obviously the buildings have toppled down and there's lots of evidence of fire happening, I'd have probably gone, I'll tell you what, that sounds to me like it was probably an earthquake.
So what happens to tectonic plates during an earthquake is that you've got these two plates and they're moving, but at the boundary between the two of them, they're stuck, they're snagged, there's friction and the stress builds up. And it builds up and builds up until at some point it can't take it any longer and then it just moves, it displaces. And that generates a whole lot of energy, a whole lot of frictional heat and noise, and that's the seismic waves that go. And that essentially is the earthquake.
Could an earthquake have made the ground drastically shift and caused the collapse of Tal el-Hammam?
So when the fault line moves, it can move vertically, or it can move horizontally, or it can move a combination of the two. And in the Dead Sea rift zone, it tends to be a combination of the two.
That's what shook the buildings, caused them to collapse, and maybe set off a chain reaction of fire. Maybe a kiln was gone, and the rest of the roofs, and the city burnt, and that's what had happened.
But for the Tal el-Hammam team, the evidence they found at the site suggests an earthquake can't be to blame.
When you get an earthquake, the ground moves back and forth. We are in a north-south strike-slip zone in the region around Tal el-Hammam. So when you have earthquakes there, things tend to move north and south. And so walls tend to fall in both directions. But all of the material evidence we're finding is pushed to the northeast, and only to the northeast. It's very monodirectional.
Crucially, the team make another discovery which suggests that the site remained unoccupied for approximately 700 years during the late Bronze Age period.
Well, in that region, one of our primary means of telling time is through pottery evidence. We just do not have pottery in the region that covers the entire late Bronze period. There's virtually none. And the second thing that you would look for is there any architecture? Now, there was a brief single building that we believe was a toll house or a way station during that period that lasted maybe a decade or two. So between the pottery, between the architecture, nobody was home. They just migrated through.
The team have uncovered evidence of a thriving Middle Bronze Age city, destroyed by a violent event, followed by a 700-year period where the site remained largely abandoned. For them, the location of Tal el-Hammam and its scale indicates it could be Sodom. But they're no closer to explaining the cause for its catastrophic demise. Then, in 2011, whilst excavating a section of the upper city, Dr. Collins's team make an extraordinary discovery.
When the excavators of that square called me over, they said, "You have to come and look at this."
They found a piece of pottery in the Middle Bronze Age layer. Thousands are scattered throughout the site. But this piece is different. On one side, the fragment looks like regular Bronze Age pottery, but on the other, the surface is green and glass-like.
It looks like one side of it is superficially melted. It's just lapping over the edge ever so slightly.
For Dr. Collins, it looks like a piece of glazed Islamic pottery. But this form of pottery wasn't produced until thousands of years after the destruction of Tal el-Hammam. Collins is intrigued by the find. The fragment looks as though it's time-traveled from a later era.
What in the world is a piece of glazed pottery doing down here this deep?
Could it offer any clues for the cause of Tal el-Hammam's destruction? Collins takes the strange-looking piece of pottery for analysis at the U.S. Geological Survey Laboratory in New Mexico. When the results come back, they are quite literally out of this world.
We know that now from the tests. Everything about this particular melted surface of pottery sherd is physically identical to trinitite.
The word trinitite comes from the codename Trinity, used in the first ever detonation of a nuclear bomb. The test took place on the 16th of July, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, New Mexico.
When the Trinity bomb was detonated, it released the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. That's actually slightly more than the nuclear bomb they dropped in Hiroshima in World War II.
In the aftermath of the explosion, scientists noticed a strange substance all across the surface of the desert.
When the bomb exploded, it sends out a big fireball, and that creates a huge mushroom cloud, a big uprush, and it took a whole load of the sand up in there, and that basically melted because of the immense heat, and then rained back down onto the desert, which cooled really quickly and then formed this glassy trinitite.
The melted glass-like surface of the sand is similar to that found on the pottery sherd at Tal el-Hammam. When it's analyzed further, experts discover something else: zircon.
Zircon's a naturally occurring mineral that you can find in rocks pretty much all over the world. Looking at zircon under a microscope, what you'll see is like a crystal-like structure, and very, very regular with very sharp, jagged edges, basically.
But the zircon inside this piece of pottery is different.
This zircon was actually a lot smoother, kind of more like a teardrop.
Experts conclude that the zircon in this fragment must have undergone an extreme process to create such a strange shape.
It suggests that this zircon had been heated up to a really high temperature, such that it even melted, and then it had cooled very quickly. Because otherwise you'd get, the more regular looking zircon that usually takes, thousands of years to cool down.
The fragment must have been subjected to extreme heat for it to have melted this way.
A normal fire will burn at somewhere between 600 and 2,000 degrees Celsius. For zircon to melt, though, you're talking at least 4,000 degrees Celsius there. That's over double the hottest fires.
Now, the surface of the sun is about 4,000 degrees. So you're talking about temperatures equivalent to the surface of the sun.
And as the excavation continues, the team unearth more and more pieces of extreme heat-blasted pottery.
Every place we have excavated across the site, we have found indicators of these high heat events. Every place we find bits and pieces. What kind of thing could do that?
From the evidence at this ancient site, we know there must have been incredible temperatures, much hotter than a regular fire. And it created a substance very similar to trinitite, but of course, there weren't nuclear bombs back then. So what could have caused this? Well, one possible option is a meteor.
Now, at our site, there is no crater on the ground for us to point to and look at and say, aha, here's the conclusive evidence that we have some kind of astral body coming in and hitting us. We don't have that.
But meteors don't need to make impact to unleash their destructive power on Earth. An incredible concussive force and a blast of high-intensity heat can result from a rare cosmic phenomenon known as a meteor airburst.
An airburst can be when a meteor in the Earth's atmosphere explodes in the air before it's hit the ground.
The damage on the ground from the explosion can be devastating.
Firstly, you've got this really hot rock, the meteor, in the air that's radiating heat that can set things ablaze. Now, when it explodes, you've got the big shock wave. That can also take temperature with it, so you can feel a heat rush. The amount of devastation you're going to see really depends on the size of the rock. Bigger meteor, more destruction.
Meteor airbursts are rare, but they have occurred in recent history. In 1908, in a remote uninhabited region of Siberia, an airburst is believed to have wiped out an area larger than Los Angeles.
An eyewitness described the sky appearing to split in two and being covered with fire. It destroyed about 80 million trees. In the nearest town, about 60 kilometers away, residents could feel the heat of the blast, windows smashed in the buildings, and some people were even knocked off their feet because of the force of the airburst strike. It would have felt like the end of days.
More recently, in 2013, cameras caught the moment an airburst exploded over the city of Chelyabinsk in southern Russia. 1,500 people suffered injuries and thousands of buildings were damaged. The team at Tal el-Hammam believe that the evidence they found points to an airburst, which left a path of utter destruction in its wake.
What we're looking at is a very large site that was literally the buildings blown off of their foundations. Artifacts, the pottery, the tools that they were using are shattered. And this basically vaporizes and incinerates everything in its path. And what we see is that all of that ash and all of that material is blown into a northeasterly direction. The only known source of the kind of concussive profile that we're seeing in the evidence, of the kind of thermal profile that we're seeing, is a meteoritic airburst.
As for the 700-year gap in habitation at Tal el-Hammam, Dr. Sylvia believes this is a direct result of the airburst as it explodes over the Dead Sea, just 13 kilometers away.
If you have an airburst event over water, it will actually produce a tsunami effect where a wave will be pushed across the landscape. You have a very high volume of now superheated brine spray of Dead Sea water that's traveling with the blast front. Well, that 700-year gap, I believe, is best explained by the poisoning of the soil with Dead Sea water that left behind a very high salt concentration.
It's possible the high salt content of the Dead Sea water would have rendered the land infertile for a number of centuries.
It was impossible to grow any cereal grains. And if you can't grow cereal grains, you can't support cattle, you can't support people, you just cannot support a civilization moving back into the area.
The science is clear, the analysis is clear, and the evidence is mounting. I'm not saying that we absolutely have it nailed down yet, But we know that all the indicators that we have are consistent with an airburst.
For the archaeologists, the destruction of Tal el-Hammam by meteor airburst provides a striking match to the biblical destruction of Sodom. Fire and brimstone rained from above, destroying the city and its people, and leaving the surrounding region uninhabitable. But not everyone is convinced.
A meteoritic event is very rare. They do happen, but they're very rare. I think before you can jump to conclusions and people can start suggesting that, you need more evidence. And I think actually an event like that would have a signature much wider and in the environmental record. So we need to look there.
Since 2005, Dr. Collins and his team have excavated at Tal el-Hammam. They've made a truly astonishing find: the remains of a thriving, vast metropolis northeast of the Dead Sea, which they believe matches the biblical description of Sodom. Crucially for Collins, their discovery and analysis of Tal el-Hammam's destruction provides a close match to the biblical account of the destruction of Sodom.
People often ask me how certain I am that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom. It's become very certain to me that there's no other possibility. It's in the right place, it is in exactly the right time frame, it has the right stuff, it has the right destruction event.
When Steve Collins first asked me to come to the dig and he said that he thought that this may be Sodom, I was very skeptical. I believe the Bible, I take the text serious, but I don't dig with the Bible in my hand, as it were. The size, the location, the way Sodom was destroyed, and my own reading again the original text make me now convinced that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom.
But the team still face scrutiny from the wider archaeological community.
We know that meteorites strike the Earth. So is this possible? Sure. Is this also a pretty speculative reaching for a possible explanation that kind of matches the story in the Bible to explain the destruction of what you want to be Sodom? Yeah, it looks like that as well.
Cynics might suggest that the airburst theory for the destruction of Tal el-Hammam is just too spectacular, too kind of space age. But just because it's a 1 in a million chance doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
The team continues to dig for evidence. To answer the question beyond doubt of whether Tal el-Hammam really is the city of Sodom. Ancient Greece. From the 8th century until the 4th century BCE, ancient Greek civilization flourished. It gave the world democracy, philosophy, and art and architecture that still dominate our lives today. At its height, the ancient Greek colonies reached from modern-day Spain in the west through to Russia in the north and Egypt in the south. It was made up of many competing city-states with their own systems of rule and patron gods. In the heartland of this civilization lay the thriving city of Helike. Helike was a prominent trading port, but the ancient city was best known for the role it played in the worship of the almighty Poseidon, the god of the sea.
Poseidon's moody, he is miserable, he's grumpy, and I find that really interesting because he is the god of the sea. I mean, the sea is obviously important for trade, important for transportation, but it can turn on you like that, and it can take lives.
It's something Helike would discover all too well. In 373 BCE, the city vanishes. According to writers across the ancient world, the entire city disappears beneath the waves. Its location is lost to the passage of time.
The location of Helike is a complete mystery, and it's one of the resounding mysteries of classical archaeology.
It's hauntingly similar to the myth of another ancient civilization lost beneath the waves, Atlantis. We ask the question, what could cause the total destruction of Helike? And is Helike Atlantis? The lost city of Atlantis. It's a myth that has enthralled us for millennia.
We all know the famous story of Atlantis, but it goes all the way back to Plato, who tells us about Atlantis as a great city with an advanced civilization which ruled over an empire that spanned continents.
According to Plato's myth, the Atlanteans created a civilization to rival the mighty Greeks. But they did not use their power wisely, and this angered the gods.
The Atlanteans grew cruel, they grew harsh, they grew hubristic, and for this they were punished by the gods. The city was destroyed and submerged and lost beneath the waves.
For centuries, it's driven explorers to search the seafloor, uncovering shipwrecks, lost treasure, but none have found the fabled lost city. It's even eluded famed oceanographer Jacques Cousteau, who led underwater expeditions in search of Atlantis in 1975. But there is another lost city, mentioned by classical Greek historians, that may offer clues. Helike. Just like Plato's myth of Atlantis, these authors record how Helike was submerged beneath the waves.
If we look at the story, Helike and Atlantis both disappeared from the face of the earth. They both disappeared into waters. Helike and Atlantis also share the same patron god, Poseidon.
And Plato wrote the story of Atlantis around 360 BCE, just after Helike was destroyed. Could Helike actually be Atlantis? The only way to know for certain is for archaeologists to locate the lost city of Helike. In the 4th century BCE, a period of time known as the Classical period, the ancient Greek city-state of Helike thrived on the shores of the Corinthian Gulf. It's a city with a rich history.
The first time we ever hear about Helike, it's in Homer's Iliad.
The classic Greek myth, the Iliad, tells how Helen, the queen of Sparta, was abducted by Paris of Troy. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, commanded the united Greek armed forces and set sail to bring Helen home.
Helike is listed amongst the many cities of the Peloponnese which send troops for Agamemnon's army to campaign in the Trojan War.
Agamemnon's forces besieged Troy for 10 long years. When this failed, they unleashed their secret weapon, the Trojan horse. This giant wooden horse was left as a gift for Troy. They accepted it and brought it inside the city walls. With the people of Troy asleep, Greece's finest soldiers emerged from inside the horse and opened their gates. Agamemnon's forces could finally breach the city's walls, and Troy fell. Homer's Iliad is a myth, but Helike's role in ancient Greek history is well documented. Helike was the leader of the Achaean League, a democratic confederation of 12 city-states in the Achaea region of Greece. Helike established colonies at Priene in Asia Minor and Sybaris in southern Italy. Trade from these created a period of great prosperity. The people of Helike believed their city was watched over by their patron god, Poseidon. Their temple dedicated to him brought pilgrims to the city from across classical Greece.
Haliki was a powerhouse in the ancient Hellenistic Greek world. It was a major religious hub, a pilgrimage spot. It was a political seat. It was a pretty significant city-state.
The temple to Poseidon gave Haliki influence in the Greek world, and they benefited economically from this pilgrimage. As war engulfed the region, it placed Haliki in a unique position. Between 492 and 479 BCE, the Persian Empire launched a series of invasions with the aim of conquering all of Greece. The allied efforts of the Greek city-states repulsed the Persians, but the Greek world was now on a collision course with itself. In 431 BCE, Greece erupted in war between Athens and Sparta. By 404 BCE, Sparta was victorious, but the economic cost across the region was dire. Poverty soon became widespread. But the people of Haliki realized just how economically important the Temple of Poseidon was to their survival. They remained largely uninvolved throughout this period of turmoil for fear of alienating either side. This decision served them well. As the dust settled, Haliki and its colonies survived, along with the Temple of Poseidon and the income this brought them. And for a city-state that relied heavily on maritime trade, it made sense that their patron god was the god of the sea.
Poseidon is the god of the trade networks. He's the god who the sailors would be praying to before they set out on their long voyages across the Mediterranean. He's the god who would guarantee you safe passage and bring you back home safely as well.
But Poseidon didn't keep the people of Haliki safe. According to the legend, the people of Haliki closely guarded the temple venerating Poseidon. When they refused to share sacred items with other cities, he was angered.
They had treated extremely badly a sacred delegation who had come from Ionia requesting copies of the altar and some other sacred items. They had dragged these sacred ambassadors from the sanctuary, and some stories say they actually killed them.
In 373 BCE, Poseidon destroyed the city. The destruction was so complete that it sent shockwaves around the ancient world.
The story of Helike's demise very quickly enters into the popular consciousness. We first get it in the writings of Ephorus, we find it in Strabo, we find it in Ovid, we find it in Pausanias and Diodorus and Polybius. It's everywhere. The story starts in 373 BCE, and we hear that Poseidon is angry with the inhabitants of Helike. And what he does is he uses his trident, he causes a terrible earthquake. A tidal wave rolls in from the sea and completely submerges the city. The entire population of Helike was wiped out in this catastrophe, one fell swoop. And not only that, but there were 10 Spartan warships which were anchored in the bay, and they were also dragged down to the bottom of the sea. So this was total wipeout.
Haliki's destruction was so severe that the only way the ancient Greek writers could come to terms with it was to blame it on the supernatural. Poseidon, the god of the sea, caused the city to vanish beneath the waves. In the years that follow, its location is forgotten, and the story of Haliki becomes Greek legend. The parallels between the myth of Atlantis and Haliki's destruction are striking. But what actually happened? And could Haliki be Atlantis? The only way to know is to find Haliki. For archaeologists to have any hope of locating the lost city and determining what caused its destruction, they need to discern what is fact and what is fiction. Was there any physical proof that Haliki had actually existed? two of Germany's leading archaeologists, Adolf Michaelis and Alexander Konza, explore the shores surrounding the Gulf of Corinth. While resting in a village, they are sold an ancient artifact, a bronze coin.
Poseidon is depicted in a very fine representation of his head, which is a very beautiful, classical, actually, depiction of Poseidon. And on the reverse, we have the main attributes of Poseidon, that is his trident, and the two dolphins swimming upwards, all included in a wreath, within a wreath.
But as Michaelis and Konza examine the coin more closely, they make a startling discovery.
The coin bears the letters Helik, which is an abbreviation of Helike. This was the first tangible piece of evidence that the city of Helike actually existed. Up until this point, all we had was the testimony of various authors and the story of Helike's destruction, but this was an actual piece of evidence.
Michaelis and Konza have identified the first piece of archaeological evidence that Helike actually existed. It marks an incredible turning point. Was the lost city of Helike more than just a legend? Could there be some truth behind its destruction? And could it help solve the mystery of Atlantis? Archaeologists need to re-examine the ancient texts describing Helike's destruction. Could they find anything else written here that might help them sort fact from the legend? A key text recounting the disappearance of Helike was written in the 2nd century CE by the renowned Roman author Aelian. Buried in his account is a detail that may lend veracity to the written destruction event, a tsunami caused by an earthquake.
There's a Roman author who talks about the destruction of Helike, and he mentions that 5 days before the event, all the animals, all the rats, all the insects went scurrying away from the site, and that people should have taken that as warning something bad was about to happen.
It's an intriguing detail. But is there any truth to the phenomenon? Geologist Ian Stewart has heard similar stories before. An animal exodus right before a major earthquake.
In 1995, I was in northern Greece, and we were starting to get reports that there had been this earthquake down in the Aegean area. I spoke to fishermen who talked about catching the equivalent of their whole yearly catch in the night before the earthquake struck. And also in their catch, strange fish that they hadn't seen, deep water, squid and things that were very rare. And one of the things that we know is the Earth's crust gets prepared for earthquakes. The stress gets pent up and there's fluids and lots of things change. So the only slight thing is whether animals, particularly ground-dwelling animals, could be sensitive to that. And that seems to be not that far from reality.
The story of animals fleeing Helike in the lead up to its destruction might just be true. And according to the ancient writers, the tsunami that submerged Helike was triggered by an earthquake. But would a tsunami account for its total eradication? To know for certain, archaeologists need to locate Helike. Only then can they begin to understand the cause of its destruction. The hunt is on for the lost city of Helike. They turn again to the ancient texts. It's believed that the remains of Helike were visible for hundreds of years after it was destroyed, and many ancient writers gave descriptions of its location. But over time, its ruins disappeared, and these descriptions lost their meaning. The archaeologists searching for Helike are forced to start from scratch, almost. Poring over the ancient texts, they find a clue. The ancient Greek geographer Strabo recorded that Helike had been submerged in what he describes as a poros. But what exactly is a poros?
Poros in ancient Greek means a narrow passage of water. Archaeologists interpreted this as the Corinthian Gulf.
It was a solid lead for the archaeological investigators. The ruins of Helike had to be somewhere in the Corinthian Gulf. The problem is, the Gulf encompasses a colossal area, 2,500 square kilometers. And according to the ancient texts, just like the myth of Atlantis, the ruins should be underwater.
The expectation was that Helike lay somewhere on the seabed in the Gulf of Corinth. And so over the generations, it becomes this holy grail of underwater archaeology to find where Helike was.
Archaeologists now have a rough geographic area for Helike. It's clear to them that it must lay submerged at the bottom of the Gulf of Corinth. But how can you locate a lost city on the seafloor? It would require an entirely new form of archaeology and a new breed of archaeologist. The hunt for the lost city of Helike is taken up by one of Greece's most famous sons, celebrity archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos. In 1967, Marinatos became a Greek national hero when he uncovered the prehistoric city of Akrotiri on the island of Santorini. For some, the civilization on Akrotiri was a strong contender for the lost city of Atlantis. But Marinatos found no evidence to back up this theory, and his ultimate dream was to find Helike. If the lost city could ever be located, Marinatos had particularly high hopes for what it might contain.
He believed that Helike would be a kind of a Greek classical Pompeii. That is, everything you would find in Helike would be there exactly as it was at the moment it was destroyed.
If he could find the city, maybe he could solve the mystery of its destruction. Could he also solve the mystery of Atlantis? Marinatos needs a way of peering beneath the waves to identify any human-made structures on the seabed. He turns to a cutting-edge piece of technology, sonar imaging. In 1973, oceanographer Paul Cronfield is brought onto Marinatos' team. He is tasked with scanning the sea floor. He remembers his time with Marinatos well.
Professor Marinatos was very excited about Helike. He said, because it's an undisturbed classical city that's basically been buried under the ocean and undisturbed for thousands of years, with all the artifacts totally undisturbed.
For this grand expedition, no expense was spared. Marinatos commandeered a Greek Navy landing craft and outfitted it with a drilling rig. If the sonar scanners identified any structures, the team would drill an exploratory core sample to see if they held any ancient remains.
The drilling ship was anchored offshore, and it would come in out of the mist and drop the ramp on the beach. And all the scientists and engineers would come charging down the ramp like invading the beaches of Normandy or something, except we were invading local tavernas for lunch. At that time of year, the not blooming jasmine is blooming and the fragrance is in the air, and we'd be sitting there listening to Greek music, looking up at the stars. You know, this is exactly how this was 2,000 years ago when the people of ancient Helike were having their dinner, and it was a very magic time.
Back at sea, Marinatos' team scanned the seafloor, hunting for any anomalies or signs of structures. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. But incredibly, they identified something.
We picked up pockmarks on the seafloor, and they were very intriguing in straight lines. God generally doesn't draw straight lines. So this could mean it might be man-made. It could be a road, or it could be a wall. We didn't know.
with the possibility of ancient Haliki lying in the depths beneath their ship, the team deployed the drilling rig to retrieve core samples. Had they finally found the lost city?
There was so much excitement each time we retrieved the core. You know, sleep was impossible. We had to be there because everyone expected to see some artifacts or something in there that would indicate a discovery. It just kept everybody very much electrified.
But all they found was mud and gravel.
After having spent all that time drilling and subbottom profiling, and then find nothing, it was very disappointing.
Despite working through the night for days on end, there was absolutely no sign of Haliki. And with the excavating season ending, another chapter in the hunt for Haliki came to a close. For Spiridon Marinatos, he would never get the chance to search again. The following year, in 1974, he died of a stroke while excavating on Santorini. He is buried at the site. The location of the lost city of Haliki remained a mystery for now. Archaeologist Professor Dora Katsanapoulou grew up on the shores of the Corinthian Gulf, close to where Haliki was said to be located. She is well acquainted with the legend of the ancient city's destruction.
People who are raised in the region, they all hear about this story because Haliki was the most important city in the region. When I was a child, I was always dreaming of becoming an archaeologist someday in order to try and find this famous lost site. So it was a childhood dream, I would say.
In 1988, Katsanapoulou assembles a team and begins turning her dream into a reality. She picks up where Marinatos left off, using sonar scanners to map the bottom of the Gulf of Corinth. Soon, the sonar picks up something intriguing.
In one location, we found remains of something that looks like being man-made. It's something that has to do with installations of a port. And in another location, in a greater depth, we may have remains of some wrecks of ships.
Analyzing the sonar readout was a man now familiar with the region, oceanographer Paul Cronfield.
We saw 10 of these features, 10 parabolic type features under the seabed. It was very exciting.
According to Aelian, the Roman writer, the night that Haliki was destroyed, there were 10 Spartan ships at anchor in Haliki's port.
For Katsanapoulou, it was starting to look like they'd uncovered an ancient port. If they could identify the 10 shapes shown on the sonar scans as the 10 sunken Spartan warships told in the Haliki legend, then surely they'd have finally located the lost city. But sonar scans alone aren't proof. To be sure, the team needs to dive and examine the structures. But here, they run into a problem.
The Corinthian Gulf, particularly in this area, is very muddy. And when divers go down, as soon as they move toward the target, it's, you know, a real cloud of mud that is raised in front of them, so they cannot really see. It's a very difficult sea to explore.
The muddy conditions on the seabed make it impossible to identify these structures for certain. Still, Katsanapoulou has a hunch these underwater features represent the ancient port of Haliki. But how to be sure? She needs a way of narrowing down the search area. Were there any clues that located Haliki near these sonar hits? Katsanapulu returns to the ancient texts. Reading the work of the ancient Greek geographer Pausanias, she comes across something. A description of Haliki in relation to the neighboring town, Aegion. Crucially, it mentions a distance.
One says that Haliki is 40 stades, that is 7 kilometers, east of the city of Aegion. Going further east, he also comes to another monument in the area which is known as the cave of Heracles Vouraikos. And he gives us a distance of Haliki from the cave of about 5.5 kilometers.
It's said that the people of Haliki came there to leave offerings to the demigod Heracles. The location of the cave is still known today. It's a key clue for Professor Katsanapulu. If Haliki is within 7 kilometers of the town of Aegion and 5.5 kilometers of the cave of Heracles, then the lost city must lie in the area where these measurements cross over. The port features that Katsanapulu uncovered are well within this region. They match the location of the ancient geographical texts. But despite repeated sonar scanning, all they could find was evidence of a port. Why wasn't the rest of the city visible on the sonar scans? Katsanapulu looks again to the ancient descriptions of Haliki's destruction. These texts had been studied again and again by archaeologists before her. But Katsanapulu has an advantage. She can read these works in ancient Greek as they were written. Had any clues been lost in translation? As she pores over the ancient writings of Strabo, she realizes incredibly this might be the case. It all hinged on the meaning of the word poros, the body of water that Haliki was said to have been submerged in.
Poros in ancient Greek means a narrow passage of water. But most archaeologists had interpreted this as the Corinthian Gulf, which was absolutely wrong, because the ancient sources knew the Corinthian Gulf by name. So they could mention the Corinthian Gulf. They didn't have a reason to say Poros. Now, what Poros would mean, in my interpretation, was an inland lagoon or lake.
According to Professor Katsanapulu's research, the lost city of Haliki wasn't at the bottom of the Gulf of Corinth after all, but had been submerged in an inland lagoon. It's a blow for those hoping Haliki is Atlantis. Plato's mythological city had been submerged and lost to the sea floor, not a lagoon. But still, in the search for Haliki, it's an incredible breakthrough. It was beginning to make sense why Katsanapulu's sonar scans only showed a port, not the rest of the city.
There was only one problem. If you're thinking about this as a lagoon, there isn't a lagoon there now. There's just solid land. So where was the Poros?
Okay, then I thought, since we have a Poros that is an inland lagoon, then the ruins of the city should lie under this lagoon, because this lagoon covered up, actually, the destroyed city.
But at the point where the sonar scans had identified a port, there was no lagoon, only dry land. But all of Katsanapulu's evidence pointed to Haliki being here. Was it possible that the lagoon had dried up?
The fact that you have a feature close to the shore that may belong to a port, that shows to you that the city is on land. So we said, okay, we checked it out, it's nothing in the sea, we have now to prepare for starting on land.
Katsanapulu steps ashore. Was there any evidence that this area had once been underwater? If she could find any, then she would be one step closer to locating the lost city of Haliki. Among the trees on a farm, just outside the town of Rizomulus, Katsinopoulou notices something unusual, a bridge, but no river. Examining the geology of the surrounding area, it becomes clear this bridge wasn't always over dry land. Over millions of years, the craggy mountains further inland have been eaten away by rivers coursing through them. As the rivers make their way to the coast, they carry with them a huge amount of rocks and debris.
One of the things that really impressed me was just the sheer amount of material that was coming from the mountainside. Those rivers that were coming through, bringing huge amounts of debris down and spreading it across the coastline. So this was one of the most dynamic landscapes I'd ever encountered.
Each winter, the rivers break their banks and deposit sediment across the entire plain. It explains why the bridge is now over dry land.
That bridge was at one point over a river, and it's no longer over a river. The river's about 500 meters away. So that tells us that the rivers have changed since the classical time.
As the sediment builds year after year, the rivers gradually become silted up and the water changes course.
The bridge is a feature that has to do with the geomorphological changes of the plain. Actually, the bridge is evidence for the shift of the river.
For Katsinopoulou, it's a profound realization. The lost city of Haliki was submerged in a lagoon, but all her evidence pointed to the location being on dry land. Katsinopoulou suspects a lagoon was once here, but had silted up over time.
The lagoon had completely been silted over by the sediments brought down by the rivers. And that's why today you do not see any lagoon in the area. The lagoon, of course, it is buried under the dry land today.
The ancient texts, the sonar scans, the existence of a lagoon, all pointed to Haliki being under this plain. But to know for certain, her team will need to break ground. Katsinopoulou and her team conduct a series of extensive surface surveys along the coastal plain. They drill boreholes down to a depth of 15 meters and examine the samples for any signs of ancient life. In 1993, they find some pieces of pottery.
Inside these soil samples were found the first pottery fragments. Until then, nothing was known from this area. Even to find some first small pottery fragments, it was something to rejoice at.
For Katsinopoulou, these finds indicate an ancient settlement is likely to exist beneath their feet. Could these be the ruins of Haliki? The team prepares to excavate. But before the archaeologists can start, they are woken in the night by a horrific noise.
We were conducting our first excavation in the area when this earthquake happened. The Aegean earthquake of 1995. We were very much alarmed because, you know, that happened early in the morning. Of course, living through an earthquake event, it's something dramatic and terrifying.
When the dust from the earthquake settles, Katsinopoulou's team finally break ground. Here they uncover the remains of an ancient building. Haliki was destroyed in 373 BCE during the classical period. But frustratingly, the remains uncovered are Roman. They date from a far later period in history. But for Katsonopoulou, it proves they're on the right track.
For me, it was very important because that proved for good that there is ancient occupation in this plain. And you have the real evidence in front of your eyes. You have a building.
As more excavations are conducted, it becomes clear that the site held a very long occupation history. It's promising news. But to edge closer to proving this is Haliki, Katsonopoulou's team need to uncover evidence that this site was inhabited during the classical period.
In the foundation trench of this building, we discovered a nice group of pottery fragments from earlier periods, like classical, and even earlier, going back to the 8th century BC. That showed to us that we were in the right track, we were in the right area.
The wealth of finds uncovered indicate that a significant, prosperous ancient city once existed here. But although the team have found traces of settlements from the Roman, the early Bronze Age, and Helladic periods, they haven't found any structures from the classical period, the era that Haliki existed in. Until Professor Katsonopoulou's team make a discovery in 2001. Beneath an olive grove, they uncover a series of structures teeming with artifacts. When they date them, it becomes clear they've hit the jackpot.
We can date these buildings as classical because of the finds, that is pottery, coins, and other that date to the 4th century BC.
The artifacts fit the time frame for the story of Haliki's destruction. And as Katsonopoulou sifts through the remains, she comes across a timely reminder that people once lived here, an object which appears to be a family heirloom.
One of the most special finds is the terracotta painted head of a female idol, which actually chronologically is not classical, is earlier than classical, because this is a 6th century BC find, and obviously this belonged to the people who owned this building, and this was something like they had inherited from one generation to the other, and was still remaining in this building in 373 BC.
Finally, Professor Katsonopoulou has proof that a large city existed here in 373 BCE, the year that Haliki is said to have been destroyed by a tsunami. Had Katsonopoulou finally uncovered the lost city? The ancient ruins her team have uncovered match the historical and geographical descriptions perfectly. But a key question remains unanswered. Was there any proof that this site had been destroyed by a tsunami and submerged in a lagoon? Without this, it's impossible to know for certain whether the lost city of Haliki had finally been found. If these ruins had once lay underwater, then the remains of aquatic life might still be present. Katsonopoulou's team re-examine the soil brought up by borehole drillings across the region. When they analyze the sediment samples, they make an important discovery: evidence of microscopic organisms usually found in a marine environment.
You have organisms in these soil samples that show that the environment in which they are found is definitely a lagoonal environment.
These ruins were once submerged in a lagoon, just as the ancient accounts of the destruction of Haliki described. For Katsonopoulou, she has proof that these ruins are the lost city of Haliki. It's an incredible moment.
Finding something that for over a century was an unresolved problem for archaeology was a major moment. It's an amazing feeling that it is difficult to describe. It is a life's work for me.
Could these ruins finally reveal the truth behind one of the ancient world's greatest mysteries? What actually caused the destruction of Haliki? According to the ancient texts, Poseidon was angry with the inhabitants of Haliki and caused an earthquake, which triggered a tsunami that overwhelmed and submerged the city. But was a tsunami actually responsible for the eradication of Haliki? As Katsanapulu's team examined the ruins, they found clear evidence that the structures had been destroyed. And crucially, the destruction pattern pointed to a great wave.
In two different locations have been found classical remains of buildings destroyed. And the interesting thing is that in one case, the way one of the walls is fallen shows that it was perhaps the result of a backwash of a tsunami.
It was looking like the ancient texts were correct. A tsunami had engulfed Haliki. But a closer analysis of the destruction layers shows something else. Haliki has suffered wide-scale destruction before the tsunami hit, almost as if the city was swallowed by the ground prior to being engulfed. What could have caused this?
The Gulf of Corinth is a really interesting area because it's the most seismically active part of Greece, and Greece is the most seismically active part of Europe.
Geologist Ian Stewart was investigating another earthquake that had occurred in 1861 when his paths crossed with Katsanapulu. What he discovered offered an answer.
I was doing what was called paleoseismology. So you kind of excavate along the fault line and you get some evidence of when that fault last moved during an earthquake. I knew there was an earthquake that had happened in December 1861. So my question was the fault that I was looking at the one that also moved in the earlier earthquake of 373 BC?
Stewart's geological analysis highlighted many similarities between the earthquake of 1861 and the earthquake that triggered the tsunami of 373 BCE. His findings match the destruction seen at Haliki.
There was large-scale coastal submergence, large areas of flooding. There was lots of mud and water that had erupted out. There was fissuring of the landscape. 373 BC was a really big earthquake. The plain dropped maybe 3 meters. The tops of the olive trees were just sticking out of the water. This would have been the most intense jolt of this whole landscape. The whole area would have been shaking. And then you just get the feeling of it kind of collapsing down into the sea. It would have been the most extraordinary of event to have lived through. Terrifying.
For Stewart, it seemed likely the earthquake of 373 BCE didn't just cause a tsunami, but shook the ground so violently that Haliki was engulfed by water from below. It's a process known as liquefaction. It occurs when wet, loosely packed soil is shaken by an earthquake. It causes the soil particles to break contact, and the moisture rises to the surface. Solid ground takes on the consistency of a liquid.
The main effects of liquefaction 373 BC are dramatic outpourings of water, in some cases kind of bursting and flooding out, but in some cases fountains, like almost like volcanic eruptions, exploding out under great pressure, transforming the whole physical kind of landscape, burying buildings, burying people, perhaps.
It seems that in 373 BCE, the ancient city of Haliki was hit by a cataclysmic earthquake. As the earth opened up, the city and its inhabitants were flooded by water bursting up from beneath their feet. With the city all but destroyed, a tsunami, triggered by the earthquake, engulfed all that remained of Helike. The city was lost beneath the waves. While Helike is giving up its secrets, the myth of the lost city of Atlantis remains as big a mystery as it's ever been. But as archaeologists continue to examine the evidence at Helike, similarities between the city's demise and Plato's tale of Atlantis become clear. Could Helike's destruction be its inspiration?
Poseidon was the patron and most important god of Helike. As god of earthquakes, Poseidon was the most important god for Atlantis. But there is another reason that Plato would be interested in Helike's destruction. He was in Athens. Helike was not very far from Athens. The phenomenon that destroyed Helike impressed very much the ancients. So Plato heard about it. There's no doubt that he heard and he knew about it.
In Plato's tale, the citizens of Atlantis angered the gods, who then sent an earthquake that made Atlantis sink into the sea. The Helike legend offers up a direct parallel. Poseidon is said to have destroyed the city in a fit of wrath at the way the people of Helike had behaved towards some visitors, wishing to venerate him.
If you look at the period in Greek history that Plato lived through, there were lots of big earthquakes. Ones like Helike, where you had the cities destroyed overnight. So to my mind, it's perfectly reasonable that what Plato did was he took reality that he was seeing unfolding around him, and he transposed that into a story of a civilization that had happened way in the past. So it's one of those kind of factional accounts, really, where there's a bit of fact in there, but there's also a little bit of fiction.